The Life and Death of Mary Ann Nichols, murdered on August the 31st, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, or Polly Nichols as she was often called by her family, friends and acquaintances, was born Mary Ann Walker on the 26th of August 1845 at Dawes Court off Shoe Lane in the City of London. She was the second of three children of Edward and Caroline Walker. We know next to nothing about her childhood and teenage years, other than that her teenage sweetheart was a boy of the same age as her by the name of Thomas Stuart Drew. However, this relationship had ended by 1863 when she met a printer by the name of William Nichols. On the 16th of January 1864, when she was 18, Mary married William Nichols in the church of St. Bride's, Fleet Street, where a plaque on the wall inside the church now commemorates their wedding. The newlyweds lived for a short time in Bouverie Street off Fleet Street before moving south of the river to live with her father, Edward Walker, at 131 Trafalgar Street in Walworth, at which address they would reside for the next 10 years. The couple would have 5 children together: Edward John, born in 1866, Percy George, born in 1868, Alice Esther, born in 1870, Elizabeth Sarah, born in 1877, and Henry Alfred, born in 1879. Around 1875, the family moved into their own flat in D Block in Peabody Buildings, Stamford Street, in the Southwark district of South London. For this they paid a weekly rent of 5 shillings and 9pence. Although the estate still survives, D Block was demolished in the 1970s in order to reduce the density of dwellings on the estate, and the children's play area now stands on its site. Over the next 5 years, Mary began drinking heavily, and her mental state could not have been helped by the fact that her husband William had an affair with the woman who looked after Mary when she gave birth to their last child, Henry Alfred. According to Mary's father, William left Mary to live for a time with this woman, and it was therefore William's infidelity that lay behind their marital difficulties. William, on the other hand, maintained that it was Mary's drinking that was responsible, and he would later state that she had in fact left him on several occasions. Whoever was at fault, in September 1880 the couple separated altogether and Mary moved out of the family home. Their children remained with William, with the exception of their eldest son, Edward, who went to live with Mary's father. William agreed to pay her a weekly maintenance allowance of 5 shillings, and Mary became a resident at Lambeth Workhouse, parts of which still survive close to Elephant and Castle in South London. She would reside at the workhouse until the 31st of May 1881, when she left to move in with a man whose identity is unknown. Around this time, William claimed to have found out that she was leading an immoral life, presumably referring to the fact that she was living with another man, although some commentators hold that he meant that he had discovered that she was working as a prostitute. Either way, he used this as an excuse to stop paying the maintenance allowance to her. Mary appealed to the parish authorities, who intervened on her behalf and demanded that William pay her the outstanding money. He argued that she had deserted him, leaving him with their children to bring up, and pointing out that she was, in fact, now living with another man. Mary lost the case, and William would thereafter only see her occasionally, the last time being about 3 years before her death in 1888. By April 1882, the relationship with the unidentified man was over, and on the 24th of that month she once again went to reside at Lambeth Workhouse, where she would remain until the 24th of March 1883, when she moved back in with her father, Edward Walker, at 131 Trafalgar Street. He also became somewhat perturbed by her heavy drinking. He would tell the inquest into her death that she was not a sober woman, and this had caused disagreements between them. He also stated that he did not think that she was promiscuous, and she certainly didn't stay out particularly late at night. The worst he had seen of her, he said, was her keeping company with females of a certain class. On the 21st of May 1882, they argued over her drinking, and the next day she moved out and went to reside once again at Lambeth Workhouse. In June 1883, she rekindled her relationship with her teenage sweetheart, Thomas Stuart Drew, who was by then a widower, and she moved in with him at the house and shop where he lived and worked as a blacksmith at 15 York Street, Walworth, in South London. Their relationship ended in 1887 when, according to later newspaper reports, Mary made away with some of his goods for drink, and having been abandoned by him, she once more began spending time at various workhouses, including her regular haunt at Lambeth. In October 1887, she may have joined the hundreds of homeless who were sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square, many of whom ignored an order issued by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, on Monday the 23rd of October to clear the square, and who were therefore arrested and charged with wandering abroad without any visible means of sustenance. On the morning of Tuesday the 25th of October, those who had been taken into police custody the previous night appeared at Bow Street Police Court, and amongst them was a Mary Ann Nichols. It isn't certain whether this was the Mary Nichols who, within a year, would become the first of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper. But if it was, the newspapers were somewhat unflattering about her, describing her as the worst woman in the square, and going on to say that at the police station she was very disorderly. Thereafter, Mary returned to flitting between workhouses, and by April 1888 she was back at Lambeth Workhouse. Here she befriended a girl by the name of Mary Ann Monk. The workhouse matron, Mrs. Fielder, then intervened and got Mary a job working as a domestic servant in the household of Samuel and Sarah Cowdery at Ingleside, Rosehill Road in Wandsworth. Mary began working for them on the 12th of May 1888, and from their house she wrote to her father, who had not seen her for 2 years, to tell him of her new situation, in which she seemed to have been quite content. Her letter read, "I just write to say you will be glad to know that I am settled in my new place and going on all right up to now. My people went out yesterday and have not returned, so I am left in charge. It is a grand place inside, with trees and gardens back and front. All has been newly done up. They are teetotalers and religious, so I ought to get on. They are very nice people, and I have not too much to do. I hope you are all right and the boy has work. So goodbye for the present, from yours truly, Polly. Answer soon, please, and let me know how you are." Edward wrote a letter in reply, but he heard nothing more from his daughter. Then, on the 12th of July, 1888, he received a postcard from Mrs. Sarah Cowdery informing him that his daughter had absconded and had stolen clothing worth in excess of £3 10 from her employers. By early August 1888, Mary Ann Nichols had made her way to the East End of London, where she moved into Wilmot's, a female-only common lodging house located at 18 Thrall Street in Spitalfields. Here she was known to the other residents as Polly. She shared a room with 3 other women, one of whom was an elderly lady by the name of Emily Holland, who was also referred to in some reports as Ellen Holland, with whom Mary became friendly. Emily would later remember Mary as having been a very clean woman who kept herself to herself as if she was melancholy, and who gave her the impression of being weighed down by some trouble. Although she did concede that she had seen Mary the worse for drink once or twice, Emily also stated that Mary never used to be fond of men, adding that, "I don't think she was a fast woman." On the 24th of August 1888, Mary left Wilmot's and went to reside at a mixed-sex common lodging house known as the Whitehouse, which was situated at number 56 Flower and Dean Street. Here she would spend her last and 43rd birthday on Sunday the 26th of August 1888. It was never established how she spent what would be the last few days of her life. The morning of Thursday the 30th of August 1888 was, according to one newspaper, magnificently fine, making a welcome change from the cold and wet conditions that had helped turn the summer of 1888 into one of the worst on record. However, in the early afternoon, dark clouds gathered over London, and at about 2:30, a heavy thunderstorm erupted, sending flashes of vivid bright lightning streaking across the sky as the rain fell in torrents for several hours. In the East End of London, houses close to the River Thames were flooded, and their residents were rendered homeless. Then, at 9 o'clock that night, a great fire broke out at a spirits warehouse in the East London docks. Firefighters from all over the district raced to the scene, where they had managed to bring the fire under control by soon after midnight. But as the exhausted firemen were returning to their stations, the call reached them that another, even more destructive fire had broken out in the Ratcliffe Dry Dock, and they had no choice but to turn around and race back to fight this raging inferno. Fires often drew crowds of spectators, and many East Enders that night headed for the docks to enjoy the spectacle, and among them was Emily Holland. Meanwhile, in the Frying Pan pub at the junction of Thrall Street and Brick Lane, a building that still stands although it's no longer a pub, Mary Nichols finished a drink and then headed off along Thrall Street to try and gain admission to Wilmot's. It was later stated that at this time she was the worse for drink, but not drunk. However, since she didn't have the required fourpence to pay for her bed, she was told by the deputy keeper that she couldn't stay there, and she was escorted from the premises. She was wearing a bonnet that none of the other residents had seen her with before, and since she was probably intending to resort to prostitution in order to raise the required lodging-house fee, she evidently felt that this would prove irresistible to potential clients. As she left Wilmot's, she turned back to the deputy keeper and laughingly told him, "I'll soon get my doss money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." So saying, she headed off into the early morning. By 2 a.m, the fire in the docks had been all but brought under control, and Emily Holland set off to walk back to Wilmot's. Heading along Whitechapel Road, she passed St Mary's Church and had just turned into Osborne Street at around 2:30 a.m. when she saw a drunken Mary Nichols staggering towards her from the direction of Brick Lane. Mary stopped, and leaning against the shutters of the grocer's shop at the junction of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road, she boasted to Emily that she had made her lodging money 3 times over, but had spent it. Concerned at her drunken state, Emily tried to persuade Mary to come back to Wilmot's with her, telling her that she would get her a bed. Mary refused the offer, but also bemoaned the fact that she had no money, informing Emily that she must make up the amount of her lodging. Then, confidently predicting that it won't be long before I'll be back, Mary staggered off along Whitechapel Road, and Emily set off through Osborne Street to head back to Wilmot's. That was the last time that anyone other than her killer would see Mary Nichols alive. At some point during the next hour, Mary would meet a man with whom she would go to a secluded gateway in a nearby dark thoroughfare called Buck's Row, and by the time she realized the evil of his intent, it would be too late for poor Polly Nichols. At 3:30 a.m, Charles Cross left his home in Doveton Street, Bethnal Green, and set off to walk to his place of work at Pickford's near Liverpool Street, where he was employed as a carman or delivery driver. Heading along Brady Street, he turned into Buck's Row and commenced walking along its right side. As he approached the looming bulk of the 1876 board school, which dominated the western end of the first section of Buck's Row, he noticed a dark bundle lying in a gateway on the opposite side of the street. As with many of the district's thoroughfares, street lighting in Buck's Row was minimal, so at first Cross could not be sure exactly what the bundle was. It looked something like a discarded tarpaulin, and so, thinking that it might prove useful for his job, Cross went to inspect it. But as he drew closer, he realized that it was in fact the prone form of a woman who was either dead or drunk. He couldn't be certain which, and he stopped in his tracks. As Cross stood rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do next, he heard footsteps approaching from the direction that he had just come from. Turning, he saw another carter, Robert Paul, walking towards him. "Come and look over here," Cross called. "There's a woman lying on the pavement." The two men stepped over the road and stooped down over the prostrate figure. She was lying on her back, her legs were straight out, and her skirts were raised almost over her waist. Charles Cross reached out and touched her face, which was warm, and her hands, which were cold and limp. "I believe she is dead," he observed. Robert Paul, meanwhile, placed his hand on the woman's chest and thought he felt a slight movement. "I think she's breathing," he said, "but very little, if she is." Paul suggested that they sit the woman up, but Cross refused to touch her again. So, deciding, perhaps somewhat callously, that they were late for work and had done as much as they could, they pulled the woman's skirts back down over her knees to cover her decency, and then they set off for their respective places of employment, agreeing that they would tell the first policeman they encountered of their find. But what neither man had noticed in the pitch darkness of Buck's Row was that the woman's throat had been slashed so savagely that, according to some newspaper reports, her head had almost been severed from her body. That discovery was made by Beat Officer Police Constable John Neal, who turned into Buck's Row and proceeded to walk past the board school shortly after Cross and Paul had left the scene. "There was not a soul about," he later told the inquest into the woman's death. I had been round there half an hour previously, and I saw no one then. I was on the right side when I noticed a figure lying in the street. It was dark at the time. I examined the body by the aid of my lamp and noticed blood oozing from a wound in the throat. She was lying on her back with her clothes disarranged. I felt her arm, which was quite warm from the joints upwards. Her eyes were wide open, her bonnet was off and lying at her side." As Neil stooped down over the body, he noticed PC John Thane passing the end of the street, and he flashed his lantern to attract his attention. "Here's a woman with her throat cut," he called to his approaching colleague. "Run at once for Dr. Llewellyn." As Thane hurried off to fetch the medic, PC Mizzen, who had been alerted by Cross and Paul, arrived at the scene. Neil sent him to bring reinforcements and asked him to also fetch the police ambulance. Dr. Llewellyn arrived at around 4 a.m. and carried out a cursory examination of the body. Noting the severity of the wounds to the throat, he pronounced life extinct. On closer examination, he also observed that the deceased's body and legs were still warm, although her hands and wrists were quite cold. This led him to surmise that she could not have been dead for more than half an hour. In fact, this observation by the doctor suggests that the murderer may well have still been at the scene when Charles Cross came strolling along Buck's Row on his way to work. As Llewellyn went about his grim business, news of the murder was beginning to filter through the immediate neighbourhood. In adjacent Winthrop Street there stood a horse slaughterer's yard where 3 slaughtermen, Harry Tompkins, James Mumford and Charles Britton, had been working through the night. They heard nothing and knew nothing of the murder until informed of it by PC Thane as he passed their premises en route to fetch Dr. Llewellyn. They had then gone round to view the body and remained at the scene until the woman was removed to the mortuary. The three men would later find themselves under suspicion and were interrogated separately by the police before being eliminated as suspects. Dr. Llewellyn was now becoming a little disconcerted at the number of sightseers that were arriving at the scene, and he ordered that the body be removed to the mortuary where he would make a further examination. Thane and Neil duly lifted the body onto the police ambulance, which in reality was little more than a wooden handcart. As they did so, Thane noticed that the back of the woman's clothing was soaked with blood, which he presumed had run down from the neck wound. He also observed a mass of congealed blood underneath the body, which was around 6 inches in diameter and which had begun to run towards the gutter. Evidently, most of the blood had been absorbed into the clothing, a fact that was all too apparent to P.C. Thane, whose hands became covered in the stuff as he lifted the body onto the ambulance. The ambulance was then trundled off through the streets to the mortuary of the nearby Whitechapel Workhouse infirmary. At 4:30 a.m, Inspector Spratling was on Hackney Road when word reached him that a body had been found in Bucks Row. He hurried to the scene of the crime, where he found one of the residents washing the blood away and was informed that the body had been removed to the mortuary. Spratling headed round to the mortuary, which in reality was little more than a brick shed, and there he began taking down the description of the deceased. At first he noticed only the neck wounds previously noted by Dr. Llewellyn, but on closer inspection he discovered something that had so far eluded everyone. Beneath the blood-stained clothing, a deep gash ran all the way along the woman's abdomen. She had been disemboweled. Spratling sent immediately for Dr. Llewellyn in order that he might comment on the newly discovered injuries. But before the medic had arrived and could carry out a more detailed inspection, two senile workhouse paupers, Robert Mann and James Hatfield, stripped the body of its clothing and proceeded to wash it down, dumping the garments in an untidy pile in the mortuary yard and, in so doing, destroying any clues that might be present. The coroner would later criticise the police for allowing this to happen, whereas the police were adamant that they had given instructions that the body was not to be disturbed until Llewellyn had conducted a full and detailed post-mortem examination. The first problem to confront the police as they launched their investigation into the Bucks Row murder was that of identifying the victim. Her clothing was, so Lloyd's Weekly newspaper later reported, of a common description. The only articles in the pockets were a comb and a piece of looking glass. This led the police to conclude that the murdered woman was an inhabitant of the numerous lodging houses of the neighbourhood, and officers were dispatched to make inquiries at these establishments. As the news of the murder spread, first one woman and then another came forward to view the body, and at length it was found that a woman answering the description of the murdered woman had lodged in a common lodging house at 18 Thrall Street in Spitalfields. Residents from that lodging house were therefore taken to the mortuary, where they identified the victim as a woman they had known as Polly. Meanwhile, Inspector Spratling had noticed that the skirt of one petticoat and the band of another article of clothing bore the stencil stamp of Lambeth Workhouse, and detectives were immediately dispatched there to get the matron to view the body and see if she could identify the victim. She couldn't do so, and stated that the clothing might have been issued at any time during the past 2 or 3 years. However, further inquiries led the police to Mary Ann Monk, with whom Mary Nichols had struck up a friendship during her most recent stay at the workhouse in April and May 1888. On the evening of Friday the 31st of August, Mary Ann Monk was taken to the mortuary and, having viewed the body twice, identified her as Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly Nichols. Acting on information provided by Mary Ann Monk, the police were then able to trace Edward Walker, and on Saturday the 1st of September he was taken to the mortuary, where he formally identified the body as being that of his daughter, Mary Ann Nichols. On the afternoon of Saturday the 1st of September, at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road, Win Edwin Baxter, the coroner for South East Middlesex, opened the inquest into the death of Mary Ann Nichols. The first witness was her father, Edward Walker, who confirmed that the victim was his daughter, Mary Ann Nichols, and he then went on to give details of her life. He was followed by Police Constable John Neal, who testified to having found the body in Bucks Row. The final witness of the day was Dr. Ralph Rees-Llewellyn, who outlined the horrendous injuries that the victim had suffered. At the conclusion of the doctor's evidence, the coroner then adjourned the inquest for 2 days. Later that evening, Mary Nichols' eldest son, Edward, arrived at the mortuary and was taken in to see the body, which he immediately recognised as being that of his mother. One newspaper commented that he seemed much affected by her untimely end. An hour later, Mary's estranged husband, William, turned up and was taken in to view the body. He too was greatly affected at the sight that greeted him, and he whispered to her, "I forgive you as you are, what you have been to me." According to several newspapers, he came out ashy white and commented, "Well, there is no mistake about it. It has come to a sad end at last." The funeral of Mary Nichols took place on Thursday the 6th of September 1888, and great secrecy was adopted in order to keep morbid sightseers away. No one was near as the undertaker and his men carried the remains, contained in a polished elm coffin, to the hearse and conveyed it to the undertakers in nearby Hanbury Street to await the mourners. The mourners, however, were late, and the 2 coaches were kept waiting in a side street. By the time they arrived, news had got out that the body was in the hearse, and people flocked round to see the coffin and to examine the plate on which was the simple inscription, "Mary Ann Nichols, aged 42, died August the 31st, 1888. A contingent of police constables, however, surrounded the hearse and prevented the onlookers from getting too close. The mourners, consisting of her father, Edward Walker, and 2 of her children, then boarded the rear coach, and the cortege finally set off. People lined the way as it headed down Hanbury Street, turned right into Baker's Row, where it passed the corner of Bucks Row, where Polly's murder had occurred the previous Friday, and then turned left along Whitechapel Road. Houses on the route had their blinds drawn as a mark of respect, and the onlookers were reported to have expressed their deepest sympathies for the bereaved family members as they went past. At the cemetery, the mourners watched as the coffin was lowered into the grave and Mary Ann Nichols was laid to rest. The inquest into the death of Mary Ann Nichols would continue at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road on several days over the course of the next 3 weeks. The coroner, Win Baxter, opted for an almost forensic approach to the gathering of evidence, and the protracted and detailed nature of his inquiries would provide the newspapers with endless column inches in which they reported all the lurid details that were coming to light. They soon realised that the public appetite for information about the crime was ferocious, and the subsequent press coverage for this and the future atrocities would help turn the Whitechapel murders into an international phenomenon. The inquest concluded on the afternoon of Saturday the 22nd of September, when the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown. In the weeks and months that followed, more murders would occur in the area, each more gruesome than the last, and the media frenzy surrounding the crimes would go into overdrive. In 1892, the residents of Bucks Row petitioned their local council, asking to change the name on account of the notoriety that had become attached to it. The council concurred, and the name of the thoroughfare became Durwood Street, as it still remains. Today it has changed beyond recognition, with only the 1876 board school surviving in the vicinity, still looming over the scene of the murder, just as it did on the 31st of August, 1888. Work on the Crossrail project is currently taking place on and around the site, and a new exit from Whitechapel Station now abuts the spot where the murder of Polly Nichols took place. In the City of London Cemetery, the site of a grave has been reused several times over and is now believed to lie beneath one of the pathways that meanders through the burial ground. However, the cemetery authorities maintain a small memorial plaque to her, and people come from all over the world to place flowers on it and to spend a few quiet moments remembering her and reflecting on the tragedy of her life and the horror of her death. Some of them even leave coins here, presumably in remembrance of the fact that Mary Ann Polly Nichols met her untimely end because she lacked the meagre sum of 4p that would have paid for her bed.